You can't have a Four Nations tournament without NHL trade rumors, am I right? And apparently there are a ton floating around, some of which may interest the Jets. Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at AJLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so is free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, you and I are going sailing on the high trading seas. We are going to take 3 ports of call: Seattle, Utah, and Buffalo. Now, each of these teams has something different to offer the Jets, and in turn, Winnipeg may have something to offer them, though I've probably ranked this in my opinion, best to least good fit for a lot of reasons. So Seattle seems like a prime target. Buffalo is kind of there, but I would say a little more in the fantasy side of things. So we'll kind of go from most likely to least likely, if you want to phrase it that way. But before we dive into our first port of call in Seattle, just wanted to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Now, let's sail on into the harbors of the Seattle Kraken. Seattle has had not a great season. The past couple of years for them have been a little all over the place, and with the Kraken kind of now aging out of their current roster, with a lot of the guys that they selected in expansion, already were in their late 20s when they picked them up. Now they're getting closer to their early 30s, and so the Kraken probably need to try and flip over this roster, which means you've got some contracts that you're going to want to move. And apparently Jared McCann might be available. Now, McCann is a guy I've talked about before. He's one of those guys that I think, for his cap hit and contract value, and the fact that he has another 2 years or so of control, for me, makes him one of the most appealing players in all of the trade market. For me, McCann is one of the clearest opportunities to upgrade the scoring talent on this team, and for a guy who's put up about roughly 150 points over the last 2 years, give or take a few, he is tremendous value. Obviously, we've talked about Bjorkstrand being one of those guys as well. McCann might be even better just because you have another year of him at $5 million, which for the price tag is pretty darn insane. McCann is one of those guys who also has positional versatility. He can play at center or at left wing. So you can basically use him anywhere you want up front, and he's generally been really good in his career. Great offensive numbers, generally good two-way play. Not exactly a defensive expert, mind you, but certainly an absolute pest in the slot. And again, for a guy who has created a ton of offense over the past couple of years, he's typically averaged closer to 30 goals. He had one season with 40 and 22-23. I don't think that that's necessarily what you should expect from him for the Jets. But then again, he would come here, probably be on our first or second power play unit, most likely the second, and really boost the 5v5 offense that the Jets already have. So this is where things get interesting, right? Because I've talked about, in this case, McCann, Gordon, a few others. There's another name that might be of interest to the Jets, and this is kind of where I've looked at one-stop shopping. That's Jamie Oleksiak. And Oleksiak is kind of what I think Winnipeg really wished Logan Stanley was. And in a lot of ways, with him kind of being a little pricey for at least one more year, he kind of feels almost like a cap dump. But in Winnipeg's case, he'd bring some veteran savvy. He's experienced. He's no spring chicken, but he's mobile enough and sizable enough to be a very physical force, a lot of, reasonable skill, offensively speaking, can move the puck without being too much of a hindrance, can PK. And so in a lot of ways, I think he actually ticks off some big boxes for the Jets. And because, again, he'd kind of be more of a cap dump in my mind, I almost wonder if this is where you start to talk about a deal that, is expensive, but maybe not crazy expensive for the Jets. Now, you're going to hear me talk about a name that you don't want to see moved. I personally will be hurt by this one, but this is probably the kind of trade where you're talking about Brad Lambert. One thing I've been thinking about is a first round pick, which will be a late first this year. Brad Lambert, maybe Logan Stanley to swap roster spots. And I think for the Kraken, I do think they've had interest in Stanley before, maybe during the expansion time. Or at least the Jets tried to protect him. Maybe this is where they send him to Seattle. It swaps out left-handed defender spots. The Kraken get a younger defender with some upside, who's sizable and kind of brings these similar Alexiak qualities. You noticed I'm doing a lot of air parentheses or air quotations because my assessment of Stanley's play. But hey, that doesn't mean other teams don't think that he has some real potential and value. So in that vein, I kind of think about that package, and I suspect the Jets would have to add more. I'm not sure if they'd maybe look to add a Barlow in that kind of deal or something. But at some point, if the Jets are really serious about going for a cup, you probably look at this as very few, if any, sacred cows. You've heard me talk about basically everyone having a price on this team. There are very few players that I wouldn't move. And this is probably one of those scenarios where if you're talking about the Seattle Kraken and you think that they can help you win a cup this year, you got to go chase it. The playoff field's not great. Winnipeg has a reasonable pool of, I'd say, like B to A minus tier prospects, maybe guys with some cosmetic flaws, but Lambert is still pretty highly regarded. I think he would get you a pretty good trade package, and if you have to add in some tertiary stuff, it's probably not enough to really upset the balance. So for Winnipeg, I think that there's a lot of impetus to think about this deal. I know that, McCann may not be the elite center you're looking for, but if you are looking at his pure production over the past couple of years, he would be one of Winnipeg's more prominent scorers, right? A couple of years ago, he had 70 points. Last year, 62. This year, 42 in 57. And again, not the be-all, end-all for, a player assessment, but McCann has always just been a really plus player in terms of offensive creation. So I think in a lot of ways, this deal makes a lot of sense. If we're talking about other players that would have been of interest, a Kakko or something would have been cool. Kakko, I think, is very much figuring into their long-term plans. So he's probably off the market, but there's Eeli Tovanen, there's Gord, who I wouldn't really go after Gord right now. Sports hernia surgery probably rules him out from being an impact player this year. And at that point, why even bother, right? I could also see the Jets maybe trying to get Sprong involved here. Sprong has, I don't know, just bounced around all these teams. I really don't understand what's going on with him. But, I mean, there's some, like, depth options if the Jets are trying to do a really big roster overhaul here for the playoff run. But I would say your two targets are probably McCann and Alexiak. If somehow you were to try and look at a Dunn or something like that, the math probably changes pretty significantly, but I don't think the Jets are going for that. The only challenge here is that you're going to have to try and figure out a way to get these guys to waive. McCann has a 10-team no-trade list, and Alexiak has like 16 teams. And I'm sure Winnipeg is probably on at least one of them. But I think with the Jets being in first, both of these guys only having a year or two left, and Winnipeg being in a really prime position to ring chase, I don't know. We've gotten guys to commit that you never would have imagined. Hellebuck signed. Niederreiter signed. Scheifele signed. I mean, all these guys are extending. Sandberg may have a long-term deal here pretty soon. You've got Morrissey controlled. Connor, I would assume, is basically a shoo-in to get a big contract extension. So, I think these guys would have some level of a fit here that, to me, makes a lot of sense. So, I think that this is a very potential deal, maybe reasonably likely. So we'll have to be patient and see what happens. Sometimes when these leaks come out, the Jets maybe wait for what follows afterwards instead of this deal as the market drives the prices for these specific guys up. So keep an eye out for that. But our next destination is a team that I've mentioned before as being a little bit of a sleeper pick. I want to chat about the Utah Hockey Club because I think that they might have some really interesting players at perhaps prices that are not going to absolutely put the Jets under a barn. So we'll chat about that in just a brief moment. But before we go any further, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Indeed. You just realized that your business needed to hire somebody yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates as fast as possible? Well, Indeed is here to help. Indeed is the best option when it comes to hiring because you can get your job posts seen on other sites, but Indeed sponsored jobs post puts you first instead. They put you at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. Those other sites, they're not going to give you the same preferential treatment. And as somebody who has actually used Indeed myself, I can tell you that the resume builder is super powerful. I could sort jobs by my work experience, my disciplines and domains of knowledge, my salary requirements, and it did all of this almost instantaneously. It was super easy, could not be faster, and Indeed matched me with a ton of great job opportunities. So if you're a business owner, I can only imagine that it's super convenient, very fast, very efficient, and we even have a special offer for you business owners right now. You can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about a couple of trade ports of call. We have departed Seattle. We are on to Utah, which Utah doesn't actually have any ports. There's no bodies of water that you can travel along to reach Utah from Seattle, but for the sake of argumentation, let's just assume that there's a river going all the way down to good old Utah. And, Utah HC has a lot of interesting players for the Jets. Guys that I think are on the list, or at least Winnipeg short list, and probably some players who aren't. One of the guys that I've routinely considered is Nick Schmaltz. Schmaltz has, I think, generally played at wing recently, although he can play at center too. He was playing at center, if I recall, for Arizona for a bit. He has always been one of those players that I think the Jets have had some level of interest in, and I think that they've maybe investigated trading for him in the past. Always been a little murky in terms of the higher level of interest and just how concrete those discussions were. But Schmaltz is a really good two-way center with some really smart offensive instincts. He's a guy that I've had a lot of interest in for a while. He's got another year after this one, and he's a little under $6 million. So, the cap hit for the production, I think, is pretty reasonable. On a not great Arizona/Utah team, in previous years, he was averaging a little bit under a point per game. He had 263 games seasons, and he had like 59 and 58 points in each of those. Last year, he had 61 and 79 in Arizona's last season, where things were just kind of falling apart. This year, he's got 41 and 56 for Utah. And I think that there's a really interesting player there. And what's also notable is that this year, his shooting percentage is really down. For a while, he had like 2 goals or something and like 30 assists or whatever. Things have started to sort of normalize for him the past couple of months. But, he's got a fair bit of value here. And I think for the Jets, he would very much be a nice middle six boost, especially with Lowry maybe handling some of the more defensive responsibilities. You've also got a guy like Barrett Hayton, and Hayton is kind of like a younger Schmaltz, a player who has really good, fine hand-eye coordination, nice release, good passing and vision, pretty decent two-way play. He's an RFA, he's 24. He'd really fit Winnipeg's timeline, and he has a pretty low cap hit. So his production right now is kind of in the decent middle tier of between a second and a third liner. But I think with the Jets, he would have a really good opportunity to improve those point totals and really grow his game pretty aggressively. So I like him a lot. I think that he or Schmaltz would be great options. You could also look at maybe a Lawson Krause. Krause, he's been on the periphery for the Jets. Nice forechecking presence, really direct kind of scorer. There's quite a bit of forward talent here that's signed to really affordable contracts. Krause doesn't have any trade protection. Barrett Hayton doesn't either. Schmaltz does, and that could be a little bit of an issue. He's got like a modified no trade clause, but I don't quite know for how many teams that applies. But it's a potential option. On defense, less options here that I think Winnipeg would be interested in. I don't think that a Dursey or a Marino is necessarily going to be available. If one of them was, you would definitely want to be talking to Utah about those kinds of players. Dursey is fantastic. He's kind of like Morrissey on the right side, would be a really, really fun dude. Marino, just a really good top four, two-way, defensively minded guy with enough puck moving ability to not be a liability. So, of the teams that have quite a few different trade packages you could assemble, Utah could be a really interesting one-stop shop, at least up front. On defense, a little more questionable. But I mean, you've got options there. There's maybe Valimaki if you think he can be a serviceable third pairing guy. Don't know if the Jets would necessarily be all that interested in him, but I think that there's a lot of value here. I think the Jets could come away with a pretty impressive haul, and maybe Utah would be interested in looking at Winnipeg's futures. They're building a young team. They clearly want to make a splashy sort of acquisition for the future, I would say. They tried to be more relevant this season. Didn't quite work out. But you can still come away with some really good futures and maybe players who are on the cusp of being NHLers, but just aren't there yet and will be in the next year or two. So this Utah squad still without a name, still without a clear identity in terms of what this team's going to look like, because they've had a lot of really serious injuries throughout the season that have sort of derailed a lot of their potential. But I think that this is a team that's young, they're fun, they're exciting, and I think going forward, as their fan base and support continues to grow, this team has, a very bright future ahead. You've got Keller, Gunther, and Michelli, and a few others, and with Cooley also sidelined right now. There's real intrigue for the future, and maybe both Utah and Winnipeg can kind of help each other out, right? Utah maybe needs to move some salary to prepare for the next stage of this team, and Winnipeg is really gunning for it all and trying to chase a Stanley Cup. So, usually in-division trades are a little funky, but I think for this one, there could be an interesting fit. One thing that would sort of be funny is if the Jets brought in Stenlund again. Stenlund's been pretty decent, but I kind of look at him as a guy who's good for your fourth line and doesn't really move the needle. So for me, Winnipeg really should be going for a higher level of offense here. I think there are other players that I would prioritize, and maybe a Lambert would be a really intriguing option there. Utah would be getting a very flashy young talent with lots of confidence and, a pretty decent history outside of the NHL so far. I know that this year's Moose season has looked a little rough, but I wouldn't read too much into that. Manitoba is just, they are like next level bad this season. I don't know what happened with them, but their offense has completely died on the vine. So the only thing with some of these players is if I'm comparing them against a McCann or something, I think I like McCann a bit more, and he's a little more, in terms of cap hit, affordable and sort of fits Winnipeg's salary structure. And that extra year, I think, is really, really nice. But, flip side, Krause has got the same amount of term. He's cheaper. I think it'd be a more middle six sort of piece, but maybe he wouldn't cost you as much to bring in. But he's still got a pretty potent shot. So, I like the flexibility that you have here, and I think Winnipeg could be a really interesting trade partner, and maybe some of these RFAs would be interesting options for the Jets too. Hayton especially, I think, really ticks off a lot of boxes, and it would also kind of answer Winnipeg's 2C question for the foreseeable future. So curious to know what your thoughts are. Is there anyone here that I haven't talked about that you would have an interest in? I guess Bukestad would be one potential option. Bukestad for me, I kind of think is again sort of in that Stenlund tier of fine player for your bottom six, not really asking him to be the big offensive driver that I think the Jets frankly need. Winnipeg at 5v5 right now is doing reasonably well, but they need more higher end talent, and that's where I think a McCann or a Schmaltz or something really would sort of fortify the top nine and make the Jets even scarier than they already are. So much of our offense is really driven through the power play. It is time to kind of get back to basics and drive it at 5v5 too. All the depth lines do it. It's really just about making sure that your top nine consistently, creates at 5v5, because that's what you're going to be doing in the playoffs. And I think, whether it's Seattle or Utah, you have a lot of forward options who can help you for the next year or two while this window is really open. After the next couple of seasons, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I don't really know what this core is going to look like. So I think for me personally, I'm looking at these next two seasons, plus this one, being the potential for the Jets to kind of keep making some moves, keep working around the core, and that's when maybe where that term is going to be really helpful. So a lot to consider and digest. But I've left one team for the end here that's a little funkier. and I don't really know how I personally feel about this. I think it's a little more complicated. Uh, for a lot of reasons, I don't think that either of the players that I'm about to discuss would become Jets anytime soon. In fact, I'd be shocked if anything happens here. But let's chat about the Buffalo Sabres and what could be if you tried to make a Dylan Cousins and Owen Power package work, which, yeah, let's just say that's very much in the fantasy land. But let's chat about it, right? We'll get to that in just a brief moment, but before we do, let's chat about FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a big fourth quarter comeback, you can still get in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, be sure to explore your live bet combinations into a same-game parlay. I've seen, FanDuel become really popular, especially for the Super Bowl, and I can only imagine as the NBA season kicks off, you have got this huge Luka Doncic trade that's going to reshape the Lakers and possibly add another ring to LeBron's already impressive collection. But the only way that you can get in on the action and be a part of it is to download the app and create an account. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just join FanDuel.com today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us as we are sailing the high trade seas for one last destination. This destination is one of the more interesting ones, in part because I frankly have no idea what they even want. I don't know if this team even knows what they want at this point because everything that they've tried the last few years just seems to go to crap immediately. The Buffalo Sabres, I just feel like they take the Buffalo Bills, lack of success and somehow make it even more unbearable to watch. At least the Bills are good in the regular season. The Sabres haven't been good in years. And every time that they do something, it just seems to backfire. They made a big trade with Ryan McLeod. And, McLeod's been good for them, but the rest of the team has just completely fallen apart. And I just don't understand what is wrong with this squad. I don't know if it's just a lack of depth talent or what. Maybe the kids aren't working out the way that they expected. I just can't even begin to describe why this team has struggled the way it has. But they are kind of in over their heads right now, and they're looking for some big changes. And I think that probably means more roster players. And so, you've got a couple of really big pieces tied to some big money deals. And this is kind of where I wonder if the Jets might be looking at a team like this thinking, Winnipeg could potentially extend its own window by sort of overhauling a couple of key positions, right? A big young defender signed to a reasonable contract, a big two-way center with a lot of scoring upside who is signed to a reasonable contract. Could you make something work there? Now, I said that in a very ideal tone because only one of those players is actually signed to a deal that I like, and that's Owen Power, right? 22-year-old top pairing defender. He's, making a little under $8.4 million for the next 6 or so years. Big player. I think Arneal would immediately love him. Extremely strong skater. Very good with a big booming shot. And, for the next couple of seasons, he doesn't actually have any trade protection. So if you're looking at a piece that apparently the Sabres would actually be willing to move, he could be an incredible get for the Jets. Now, what you would have to give up for Power is also going to be incredible. This is where Perfetti Lambert Plus starts to become a reality. You're talking about like a game-changing, franchise-changing blockbuster. That's the kind of trade that Power would entail. What I sort of wonder is, Dylan Cousins sort of sits on the opposite spectrum of this, right? Cousins has 5 or 6 years left. He signed for $7 million or just a little over that, and things have really gone awry for him. And when you look at this underlying stats profile, it's not really clear what kind of player he is. This middle six, 23-year-old center who had a couple of really big offensive seasons, and then things have just sort of died. And I don't know if it's because there's something with the style of play that he has. Is it the Buffalo Sabres coaching staff not really understanding what he does well? Would you say that he's a gamble worth taking? And I don't know. For me personally, I don't like him as much. If you were like to take on a Parayko deal, like I could see, the Jets basically being paid to take Parayko on, and in a lot of ways, you know what you're getting with Colton for the most part, and there's a good chance that you can expect a rebound. With Cozens, don't feel that as strongly. Power, I think would immediately do well here. Cozens, I don't know on that one. And apparently there are some character concerns with him, maybe work ethic issues. And so for a lot of reasons, I don't really like this sort of trade scenario. But I kind of wonder if you were to try and figure out a way, and I don't even know how this would be possible because the amount of salary here that you're taking on is, kind of like several players worth of salary in terms of Winnipeg's roster. Almost 15 million or a little over 15 million. That's a lot of cash. And I don't know that the Jets have the roster and cap space to make all of this fit. But if you try to bring Power and Cozens in as this massive blockbuster and moved something out, I mean, it's an interesting gamble. But again, I kind of look at this as like extreme fantasy. Power could be had. Again, I think what the Jets would have to give up if they just want Power is probably pretty intense. But again, if you are trying to overhaul your defense for, the rest of, this entire competitive window that you've got Hellebuck and beyond, Power would do that. He's very young. He's 22. He's tied up for the foreseeable future, basically for the rest of his prime years. I don't hate it. I could see that. Cozens being a part of the equation is where I have some real pause. I don't know about that. The good news for the Jets is that there are other players that could be of interest. Alex Tuck is really good, and he signed at an extremely reasonable under $5 million contract, but he does have a modified no-trade clause, and so that could be a problem. But, man, I mean, I just don't even know what the Sabres would want at this point because, young talent doesn't necessarily fix how deep the rot seems to be. I don't know what's wrong with that team. They're about to deal with an RFA crisis here in about 2 years. And so I just look at this squad and I'm just like, man, you could throw them any number of trade packages. And I don't really know if any of them actually address what has consumed this team. And, they're trying to foist Cozens onto people. They're trying to move on from Bowen Byram because Byram's an expiring RFA who's looking for a massive raise, like $6.5-7 million, which is kind of like Pionk money, and he also sort of has Pionk level performance. So, man, I just think that they're a mess. Even with all the things that I've said about the Jets over the years, I got to say I'm very glad I'm not a Buffalo fan. The Sabres are just a total disaster in so many ways, and in a lot of ways I feel for their fans. I mean, the fans deserve better than this. So, we'll have to just wait and see. But if there's a way to make Power a Jet, let me tell you, I would be banging on that door yesterday. It could be a transformative thing. It could be one of the most insane trades ever. And for Chevy, if he's really serious about swinging, not just for the fences, but for like a Dodgers World Series kind of swing, probably the kind of deal you're talking about. But curious to know what you think about the Sabres. Would you do business with them? Do you think they're even open for business with the Jets? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening. Tomorrow's episode, I'll actually have the recap of Canada versus Sweden. For some reason, apologies. I thought today was the game. I believe I had my dates mixed up. So we'll have that recap tomorrow. Should be a fun time. Looking forward to it. We will see y'all then. But for tonight's episode, that is all the time that we have. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.